Very nice to see you. Thank you.
My very first question is this कि ब्रिटिश colonial rule में जो policies बनी थी environment के लिए और वाइल्ड लाइफ और क्लाइमेट के लिए वो कितना शेप कर रही है इंडिया को अभी भी?
I think they shaped India very deeply, very profoundly. And I think some of the impacts were immediately visible to do with the government control over forest lands, starting in the 1870s, for example, to do with the mineral extraction that was going on. But some of the effects, I think, took longer to become visible. And I think one of the big legacies of colonialism in India was its impoverishment of the country. For the reason that led the generation of freedom fighters in India, when they took power, to try to accelerate development as quickly as possible. I think that was an understandable impulse because there was a feeling that we have to catch up from all that colonialism has set us back. But that, I think, maybe unwittingly, that actually perpetuated some of the colonial policies, particularly if you think of the very top-down approaches to development, the large dams, in a way that was a very colonial approach to dominating nature, which was quite different from earlier traditions of thought in India. And actually, in order to overcome the colonial legacy, you actually see a generation of policy makers and political leaders in India after independence actually intensifying that assault on nature. So I think there are immediate consequences of colonialism, and I think there are sort of much more long-term consequences.
Sir, your famous book Unruly Water, and you discuss about the role of water in shaping history and migration. Can you please elaborate that?
Yeah. So I think human life is so intimately connected with water, especially in this part of the world in a monsoon climate. The monsoon shapes the rhythms of agriculture. The monsoon is what makes possible the whole Indian Ocean trading network. I mean, we think about how ancient are some of the connections between India and Southeast Asia, India and West Asia. In a way, it was only the fact that navigators and sailors managed to master the monsoon winds and understand the currents and patterns that allows this thriving Indian Ocean civilization. So I think in that long-term way, we can see how a particular knowledge of this climate, the ability to profit from the ecological diversity that it brings, allowed for a lot of flourishing. And then water is also a risk. Shortages of water have, over very long periods of time, led to short-term migrations during periods of drought. Same when it comes to flooding. And I think one of the big shifts, going back to our earlier point, one of the big shifts that comes is the idea that water needs to be mastered, that water needs to be conquered.
Okay.
And of course, it can't be. And so in some ways we see that however intensive there's ability to the attempts to engineer and to control water, there are multiple unintended consequences.
Okay. So we are sitting in Rajasthan, and if you see in Rajasthan, there are the portion of Rajasthan where the migration is not from rural to urban,
Yes.
but rural to foreign migration.
Yes.
How do you see that rural to foreign migration, especially in these parts of area?
Well, that was a very common pattern even in the 19th century. I mean, most of the migration, something like more than 20 million people moved from South India, from Tamil Nadu to Burma, to Sri Lanka, to Malaysia. That was all rural to overseas migration. I mean, these are cultivators or they're farm workers, and they are going to, same with the indentured migration from North India, from Bihar and from UP, those who went to the sugar plantations in Mauritius and Fiji, most of them are coming from rural areas. And so I think we continue to see that pattern where there is a direct link between rural to foreign migration. But of course, it's not the very poorest in rural society who are able to undertake those long journeys because it's very expensive to pay the recruiter and all of the fees and charges that are involved. And so, very often it's people sort of maybe in the middle rungs of rural society who are able to make those long distance journeys.
Okay.
And I think Debt is, of course, a major part of that mechanism. That was also true in the 19th century. It's still true now, that families become indebted to landlords, but also to labor recruiters, and that actually constrains the options of those who wish to migrate.
Okay. To be very honest, a frank question: is Indian government serious about climate change
About climate change,
and migration as well?
let me put it this way. I think any government is more serious about climate change than the US government. So I think the fact that you don't have in India or in China outright denial of climate change in the way that you have in the United States is a good starting point. On the other hand, I think a lot of policies that have been passed recently have actually gone backwards in terms of some of the standards of environmental protection that have been put in place in India through the very fervent efforts of environmental activists and administrators going back to the 1980s and 1990s.
Okay. Sir, how climate change affects agriculture or vice versa?
Deeply. I mean, I can't imagine any sector of society more directly affected by climate change than agriculture. And I think one of the things that climate scientists have shown us is over the last 20 years or so, the behavior of the monsoon has really become very unpredictable. And you have many more extremes of both wet and dry, many more break periods during the monsoon season, and then extremely intensive rainfall. This, of course, makes it very difficult for farmers to rely on their intuitive understanding of climate to make the choices and decisions that they make. And I've seen work by anthropologists and others who are interviewing farmers, and one of the strong messages that comes out is the sense that deep climate knowledge that farmers have is becoming increasingly unreliable because the climate is changing so quickly. And of course, water availability, more than anything else, still is at the very heart of especially Indian agriculture.
How can we spread awareness about climate change in a common person, in common people of India?
I think
How
it's,
can we aware them?
I think it's very important for that. The language of climate policy, even in India, is still primarily English. And I think it's very important for multiple forms of knowledge in multiple Indian languages to be circulating, so that there is a translation of climate science into terms that are meaningful to people on the ground in their own lives.
Okay. Sir, how do you see the migration pattern shifting in 21st century?
I think we can tackle that question both domestically and internationally. I think in both cases, I think we are witnessing and we are going to continue to witness an increase in migration. But I think that migration is also quite carefully patterned. Very often it relies on existing family networks or social networks or village networks that mean that people from this place go here and not sort of somewhere else. There are very strong patternings, and I think international migration is increasing, will increase, but it is also both expensive and dangerous. I mean, there are very strong and ever stronger restrictions on migration, certainly in many countries in the global north. Borders have become very militarized, very dangerous places, and so I think there are also huge risks that will come with this sort of increase in migration.
Okay, is India a very poor country to care about migration, or that's the West people's responsibility to care about the migration or the climate change?
I think everyone needs to care about climate change.
Are we really that? Are we really that much sufficient to care about that? Because in India we lack a lot of basic needs.
That's right. I think the question then is how we care about it, because on the one hand, India both has contributed in cumulative terms relatively little to the origins of the climate crisis. I mean, that is very clearly, if we look at the cumulative carbon emissions, for example, the global north is still overwhelmingly dominant, and that is also where wealth continues to be concentrated. So in